You've probably seen head tracking before if you watch a lot of videos of simulators and games like flight simulators, spaceflight games, driving simulators, and other various games where movement of the camera can become difficult and tedious with the use of mouse or gamepad control only. Head tracking can be a very efficient way of moving the camera while in a simulation, and it can make the experience much more immersive or easier to control and follow with when compared to using something like your mouse to look around. Today I'll be going over what the popular options are for head tracking and what you should use for your specific use case, depending on your budget and what kind of equipment you would like to be using and how much equipment you'd want. There are quite a few options and it can become daunting for a first time user of head tracking, so I'll cover these options so that you can get the best experience possible out of your simulator or game. As this is a beginner's guide, I'll go over the basics of head tracking first. Feel free to skip to the next chapter of this video if you already know what head tracking is. In basic terms, head tracking is simply the emulation of a mouse-like movement, but instead of using your mouse to perform these movements as an input device, you're using your head as an input device instead. Basically, you are turning your head into a mouse that can control the camera movements and much more. When I say you're turning your head into a mouse, I don't mean you will lose control of your mouse pointer and must use your head to move it. Instead, it is simply just another input device that allows you to communicate actions to your computer. Most serious simulators have full support for head tracking protocols, and there are many to use in this case. However, some games do not support head tracking. If the game supports movement of the camera with the mouse, then you can easily set your head tracking device to emulate mouse movement so that head tracking can be used in these games, albeit a bit more ineffectively. Head trackers are determined by how many degrees of freedom they have. Almost all options will have 3 degrees of freedom, which means you can pitch, roll, and yaw your camera view. Other head trackers will have 6 degrees of freedom, which means you can do pitch, roll, and yaw, but you can also move the camera upward, downward, left, right, forward, and backwards. These are known as translations as they move you in the X, Y, and Z directions. Be aware though that some options that are available for head tracking require lots of equipment, while others do not require that much equipment at all. While head tracking can add a lot to your simulation experience and immersion, it does have its faults, which can be either specific to certain head trackers or to all head tracking devices. Firstly, all of the options that are presented here will require you to have at least some kind of equipment, whether that be a webcam, IR tracking lights, or an entire headset. This means that if you've never had a webcam before, for example, you may need to end up getting one. Some head tracking devices will require to have something attached either to your headphones, to your head, or to your face. This can be annoying for some as they may need to have another wire dangling from your head if they don't have a wireless option, or they may need to make modifications to hold these devices onto your head, such as with TrackIR. Finally, almost all the options presented here, except for one, require you to move your head while maintaining view of your monitor. This means that you will not have a true one-to-one scale of head movement and will have to exaggerate the head movement far to actually see behind your back. Only one option presented here does not require that, which I will go into more detail on later on in this video. For all of these options, they require some programs or applications running on your computer to make them work effectively, which I am going to list here and state what they are for. I'll also make sure to state under each option what program or application is required to use certain head trackers. First off, you have EDTracker, which is an open source and free application that allows you to use multiple head tracking solutions all in one program. It is the most commonly used in the DIY head tracking market and provides a wide variety of tools and options to make your DIY head trackers work. There is an alternative to EDTracker known as FaceTrack which does a similar thing, except it has a built-in face/head tracker. However, I find the results of the face tracking not optimal anymore, as it gets quite jerky without extreme fine-tuning. FaceTrack also requires you to make a payment beforehand to access the program. Next, there is the TrackIR application built specifically for TrackIR devices. This leverages the use of the TrackIR camera and clip to allow you to modify your tracking curves and settings, allowing fine-tuning of these devices. This will only work with a TrackIR camera and clip unless you have built a custom LED clip with the exact measurements of the TrackIR clip itself. There are also programs associated with some VR headsets. These range from the Oculus app for Oculus-specific headsets to Steam VR for the majority of VR headsets that want to run PC VR games as they're known, and Windows Mixed Reality for headsets that support that. Depending on your headset, you may require the Oculus app for Oculus headsets, Steam VR for something like the Valve Index and the majority of headsets that are out there, and Windows Mixed Reality being built into Windows 10. Now that we have all those out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the options that you have available for head tracking. First would be an application for iOS and Android that goes by the name SmoothTrack. SmoothTrack lets you use your phone's front-facing camera as a head tracker for use on your computer. It connects either by using a direct wired connection from your phone to your computer or through the use of your local network to transmit the data remotely. This is an excellent option for people who only have a smartphone and want to be able to use head tracking in their games. From my experience when I used the app, it was smooth and the head tracking worked pretty well overall, especially if you have a phone that has good facial recognition, as I believe it can leverage these features to provide excellent head tracking. The issue I have with SmoothTrack is that it will reduce the overall lifespan of your phone's battery. The app requires a lot of power, at least when I was using it, to operate, and while it does have a darkened screen option, it was using my battery quite drastically, draining it and therefore reducing the lifespan of it. If you have a somewhat recent phone that you don't use anymore, you could easily repurpose it to be a head tracking device. It also has 6 degrees of freedom, so you have the full range of motion if that is something you are looking for. If you're looking for a cheap option to head track and only have a smartphone, this is the best option to go with and definitely is worth the $10 price tag. This option will require the use of the AITrack program or FaceTrack No IR program. AITrack is the next option here, and it is a totally free option available for your computer and runs as a program in the background of your main computer. The application leverages the use of your webcam to provide head tracking by identifying features on your face and using it to provide camera movements using your head in the simulator or game that you are playing. This method is much more preferable for people that have webcams available, as it runs straight off your computer and requires minimal setup. This option, however, requires CPU power to do the calculations required to translate your head movements into camera movements. Therefore, if you do have a weaker CPU with less than 4 cores, this option may not be the best choice for you, or if you are already CPU bottlenecked. I've also found that the frame rate of your webcam is a big factor, as running it with a 30 FPS webcam will not be nearly as smooth as if you're running it with a 60 FPS webcam. So do keep in mind that the higher FPS on your webcam will result in smoother performance. The translations, such as the movements forward, backwards, left, right, up and down, can be quite buggy as well sometimes, which you might have to disable so as to keep your experience smooth, meaning ultimately you will be stuck with 3 degrees of freedom most likely rather than 6 degrees of freedom, which is still perfectly usable in my opinion for combat situations where you need fast camera movements without having to use the mouse. The only time I really see you needing translations is if you are trying to lean forward into the cockpit to look at your instruments better, or try to see something very specific that is small. Otherwise, I don't believe you require the translations, and 3 degrees of freedom is perfectly fine if you're looking for a basic head tracking setup. This option can be used with either AITrack or FaceTrack No IR. Next up is Aruco. Aruco is an interesting way of performing head tracking. Instead of using your face to track movements like the previous 2 options, this method requires you to print out and cut a marker on a piece of paper, then mount it to your head, either to your headphones or some kind of hat. This method is more precise than using your face most of the time, as it is a fixed tracking position using your webcam. It is also the cheapest method for something that has a physical fix. Ultimately, this is going to be your cheapest option that provides a lot more accuracy than the other 2 options, as it only requires you to have a printer and some way of mounting the card to your head, and of course a webcam. There is a great video that was made on Aruco tracking and can get you set up with it very quickly and efficiently, which I will leave a link down to in the description or as a card in the top right. The downside to this option is that you will first of all have to have a square card on top of your head. This can look odd, or it can be a bit finicky to deal with, especially when you have to remove it and put it back on. It also requires a card to be visible by the camera and therefore requires a good bit of light in the room you're in for it to work. This method also heavily depends on the frame rate of your camera, as lower frame rates will result in tracking that is not as smooth. Aruco also supports 6 degrees of freedom. It can be used with AITrack or FaceTrack No IR. This is a bit of an odder option, but works perfectly fine as an option for head tracking. It is known as EDTracker and provides a 3 degrees of freedom experience. The reason some prefer this option even though it only has 3 degrees of freedom is that it requires no additional equipment other than the EDTracker itself. It tracks yaw, pitch, and roll all through the device itself and does not need a webcam or anything else to operate other than a computer. It operates smoothly and works really well in the 3 degrees of freedom it tracks. The obvious downside to this is that you can't translate your movements and can only do yaw, pitch, and roll, and it requires some setup as there is some DIY versions available that require you to solder, or you can buy a pre-soldered version with the enclosure. There used to be a wireless version sold by the original site edtracker.co.uk, but that website has been down for a while and hasn't seen any activity, which sadly might mean that they no longer sell the wireless version. You might be able to find some schematics or something of the wireless version online, though I wasn't able to personally. Therefore, you will have to have a wire attached to use this method and have some tinkering ability to get it working functionally. This option will cost around $40 for a pre-soldered option, or less if you opt for the DIY options. This is used with OpenTrack or FaceTrack No IR. This is one of the more common options that is out there when it comes to DIY or cheaper head tracking solutions. This solution requires you to put together a device that has 3 LEDs in conjunction with a PS3i camera that has had its IR filter or infrared filter removed and exposure and gain turned down to the lowest setting. This is a cheaper version of what the next head tracking solution called TrackIR provides. It does the same thing of having 6 degrees of freedom and works really smooth when you get it set up correctly. The issue is that this does require a bit of time to get perfect if you are making it on your own by soldering 3 LEDs and then putting them in a certain shape and distance from each other. There are pre-made options available from 2 companies that I can verify, which I will link in the description. They are TrackIR and daunting. These 2 companies make excellent head tracking products, providing kits that either have the clip alone or a bundle with the clip, camera, and a monitor clip for the PS3i camera. I believe that TrackIR is currently not selling the PS3i camera, so daunting is probably your only option for a full kit. They work brilliantly and can provide a very good alternative to TrackIR. This is what I currently use for my head tracking solution when I'm looking for ease of use and overall effectiveness. It will set you back from $70 for a wired head tracker to $115 for a wireless head tracker if you opt for the full kit with PS3i camera and other various additions. On their own, they range from $50 for a wired tracker to about $100 for a wireless hat. This requires the use of OpenTrack or FaceTrack No IR. This one is easily one of the more popular options when it comes to head tracking, and it is TrackIR. TrackIR is a product developed by Natural Point. It costs around $170 for the package with the TrackClip Pro. The popularity stems from it being the only professional product that exists that can perform head tracking at such a degree, providing an excellent head tracking camera alongside good software to calibrate that head tracking experience. The issue that most have with it is that they charge $170 for the Pro Clip package and have not had any true competition that would require them to innovate further, essentially leaving the product stagnant without much in the way of new tech and features. You are essentially paying $170 for a product that is a webcam that can do high refresh rates, some reflective metal hat cap device, and a plastic clip with 3 LEDs in them. These options can be found for much cheaper with companies like TrackIR and daunting. If you're looking for the best of the best in head tracking and don't mind spending a lot, this option is going to be the one for you, as the head tracking camera is still one of the best on the market with a very high frame rate and accurate tracking overall, although TrackIR is developing their own camera they've stated. That is yet to be seen. This can be used with either the TrackIR program, which is recommended, but it can also be used with OpenTrack and FaceTrack No IR, I believe, if that is something you desire, though I don't see why you would. Next we got the Tobii Eye Tracker, which is another option you can go for. It is the second most expensive item on this list, coming in at $229 for the Tobii Eye Tracker 5 from the official store. This option is quite unique as this uses a special camera that is attached somewhere on your monitor or near your desk, which then tracks your eye and head movements to provide camera movement. However, with this option you are not only getting just an eye and head tracker, but it is also used for a variety of other things such as competitive gamers so that they can gauge if they are tunnel visioning in games like MOBAs, so it does have a variety of use cases to it to justify the high price tag. It also supports 6 degrees of freedom. My issue with the Tobii Eye Tracker is that some games do not natively support the Tobii Eye Tracker, as it has its own protocol, while others do. The only solution to making this work with any game is to use something like FaceTrack No IR or OpenTrack, which have separate protocols for this, but this means you may not be getting the full 100% experience out of the system unless native support is implemented into the game that you want, with 162 games currently supporting eye tracking natively at the time of making this video. This option is great if you're going to be using the eye tracker not only for eye tracking, but for the other features as well. As stated, this is either natively supported by the game or requires something like OpenTrack or FaceTrack No IR. The final option may come as a surprise to someone who new to head tracking, but virtual reality, which I will refer to as VR at this point, is one of the best methods of head tracking that has come around recently. Virtual reality is one of the most immersive experiences you can find in the head tracking market currently, with its versatility to play games that have been designed for VR, to using it in simulation and gaming titles for head tracking, and making you actually feel like you are there. It is very immersive and can blow things like TrackIR and other head tracking solutions out of the water. Once you experience VR in your favorite simulator, it is hard to want to use conventional means of head tracking. The issue with VR is that it can be quite expensive, although the cost of head-mounted displays like the Quest 2 are bringing VR costs down, and require a beefy computer to run at a reasonable frame rate, as the frame rate required is usually at 90Hz, though with Oculus headsets you can use something known as asynchronous space warp or ASW to run the headset smoother at lower frame rates. It is also the only option that will be able to support full one-to-one tracking, meaning that if you wanted to look over your shoulder, you would need to physically move your head so that you could actually see over your shoulder. This can be seen as immersive to some people, while others might find it straining on them to have to constantly move their head very far. But I believe most, if not the majority of people, are in the camp of it being immersive, since if you were flying a real fighter jet, for example, you would need to move your entire head over your shoulder to look behind you. Overall, this option is the most expensive one here, but will also provide you the most immersive experience overall, especially with advancements in technology that have been made in the VR sector. Requires applications specifically built for VR like Steam VR, Windows Mixed Reality, or the Oculus app. To conclude this video, I'll order my preferences, like my personal preferences, for the most recommended to the least recommended options. First, we're going to have virtual reality, followed by DIY head tracking with the PS3 Eye camera, then SmoothTrack, then the Tobii Eye Tracker, then TrackIR, then Aruco, then AITrack, then the EDTracker. My reasoning for putting VR at the top is that you cannot get an experience like VR with other head tracking options out there. It is one hell of an experience. It can really bring your sim to life, something that other options just cannot do effectively. It does have the drawback of not being able to see your physical controls, such as your joysticks and whatnot, but for the fact that you're not only getting touch controllers to use with other VR titles, or not touch controllers, but just VR controllers, you also tend to get used to not being able to see them and being able to feel out for certain buttons. The DIY option for head tracking I find is really good if you don't want to use VR, as it is a cheaper option than TrackIR and works just as well, with pre-built options available from the likes of TrackAt and Dell and Clip. SmoothTrack works really well but does drain the life of your phone, so that is important to keep in mind, and if you do have an older phone just sitting around, it is a perfect way to give that phone a new life to be useful again. The Tobii Eye Tracker is a great option for people that want to use this device for head tracking, alongside the other features such as Windows Hello and eye position monitoring, as it provides the best layout overall for situations like these. It provides stellar head tracking in games with native support, with pretty good tracking when using FaceTrack No IR or OpenTrack in conjunction with the eye tracker itself. TrackIR seriously needs to consider the amount they charge for their head tracking solution and make it more available, because I can't find it in my country for less than $300 at this point, me being in Canada. So for what you get, I don't believe it's worth the price that they're asking for, with reports of even the TrackClip Pro being easy to break, something you shouldn't expect from a $170 product. Aruco is fine for people who want something accurate but cheap, but it can also be hard to set up in a way that you can remove it quickly when you're not using it. Ingenuity is quite important with this option. AITrack, while it works well, it does not translate movements very smooth and requires a high frame rate camera to achieve smooth levels of movement, as at 30 FPS it can feel delayed at sometimes, like there is a big amount of latency. Finally, EDTracker comes last for me, as it seems the support for it has dwindled away and no longer exists, therefore leaving you with something that, while it works pretty well, requires a lot of work and tinkering to get right, only for you to get 3 degrees of freedom rather than the full 6 degrees of freedom. I do know that there is a pseudo 6 degrees of freedom, but really I don't think it works as well as just having true 6 degrees of freedom. Thank you all for watching this video. If it helped you out, I'd appreciate it if you left a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to keep up to date with the content that I release. Anyways, I hope you all have yourselves a good one.